The freezing Vermont wind whipped across the porch, but the chill radiating from my husband Jason and his mother Brenda was far colder. We had just buried my mother, yet they weren't here to grieve. They were here to execute an eviction. Brenda looked at me with clinical detachment and said, "The house is sold. You are homeless now." She knew perfectly well that the legal eviction notice was still pending, but she was counting on my grief to make me cave before the sheriff's department even got involved. Before we go any further, drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. I didn't cry, I didn't gasp, and I certainly didn't ask them why they were doing this. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I stood on the wooden planks of my childhood home, clutching the manila envelope in my hands, and I simply smiled. Jason blinked, his arrogant posture faltering for a fraction of a second. He had expected me to collapse into a weeping heap on the porch. He had anticipated the frantic, desperate pleas of a blindsided wife. Instead, he was staring at a woman who was mentally calculating a balance sheet. For years, I had believed that my marriage was a partnership, a joint venture built on mutual respect. But standing in the bitter cold, I realized it had only ever been a subscription, with me footing the bill. The renewal date had officially expired. They weren't shocked by what they had done. They were shocked that I had instantly stopped playing along. Brenda's smug expression twisted into a knot of confusion as my smile widened. She had engineered this ambush perfectly, waiting until my mother's funeral to blindside me when I was supposed to be emotionally bankrupt. She had engineered this ambush perfectly. She waited until my mother's funeral to blindside me. She struck exactly when I was supposed to be emotionally bankrupt. She didn't realize that grief is a highly efficient clarifier. It strips away the noise and leaves nothing but cold, hard data. And the data told me that Jason and Brenda viewed my family's property not as a sanctuary, but as unassigned inventory waiting to be liquidated. I didn't yell or throw a tantrum. I bypassed the emotional reaction entirely. I stepped past them, unlocked the heavy oak door of the cabin, and walked inside. Jason followed me, his boots heavy on the hardwood floor, demanding to know why I wasn't packing my bags. He stated, with absolute entitlement, that the real estate agents were arriving in 2 hours to finalize the staging. I didn't argue. I walked directly to the kitchen counter, opened the manila envelope I had brought from my mother's attorney, and extracted a single sheet of paper. It was a deed of trust, heavily notarized and completely irrevocable. I placed it face up on the granite island. I was not a homeless victim. I was the absolute legal owner of the estate, designated through a generation-skipping trust that Brenda's aggressive real estate brokers had completely missed during their sloppy, unauthorized appraisals. I had been so preoccupied with bailing Jason out of his endless financial messes that I hadn't properly reviewed the trust documents. My mother insisted I keep filed away. I had trusted the lawyers, and more importantly, I had trusted Jason to manage our joint paperwork. Jason looked at the document, the color violently draining from his face as his eyes scanned the legal seals. His mind struggled to process the sudden, catastrophic devaluation of his impending payday. He had confidently written checks against an account he thought he possessed, only to discover that the bank vault was permanently sealed. I looked at him with a detached curiosity of an auditor finding a massive discrepancy in the ledger. I had been the silent investor in his version of our family for far too long. Now, I was initiating the hostile takeover of my own legacy, and the eviction notice they had tried to serve me was officially marked return to sender. To understand how we arrived at this freezing porch, you have to understand the slow, methodical erosion of a boundary. For years, I had subjected myself to the trap of cruel normalization. This is a highly insidious psychological mechanism where toxic people disguise their malice as polite concern, gradually conditioning you to accept their disrespect as a standard operating procedure. When you are caught in this trap, you do not instantly recognize that you are under attack. Instead, you slowly internalize their criticisms, convincing yourself that if you just become more accommodating, the friction will finally stop. You normalize their cruelty because the alternative, admitting that the people you love actively want to diminish you, is too painful to process. I was a dedicated high school teacher, a profession I loved deeply, but to Brenda, it was nothing more than a pathetic, low-yield hobby. Every Thanksgiving, every family dinner, she would make polite, razor-sharp jabs about my salary, my ambition, and my supposed lack of corporate footprint. I absorbed those insults quietly, believing I was keeping the peace. Meanwhile, I was quietly liquidating my own savings to bail out Jason's endless string of failed accounting ventures. He was a man who styled himself as a financial genius, yet his ledgers were constantly bleeding red. Whenever his speculative investments crashed, I was the designated safety net. I paid the mortgages, covered the car loans, and silently balanced our household deficit while he took the credit for being the man of the house. I had mistaken weaponized incompetence for bad luck. I had allowed my own life to be treated as a limitless funding source for his bruised ego. Brenda enabled all of it, constantly reminding me that a good wife supports her husband unconditionally. In their twisted corporate structure, my loyalty was an obligation and my capital was their birthright. I didn't see the theft because they were executing it with a smile. They drained my emotional and financial reserves, treating my patience as a renewable resource that they could endlessly exploit. But standing in the kitchen of my mother's cabin, the fog of that normalization completely evaporated. I saw the last 6 years not as a marriage, but as an aggressive, unmitigated scam. Jason hadn't married a partner. He had acquired an unpaid employee and a silent underwriter for his failures. They had patiently waited for my mother to pass away, assuming her death would completely break my spirit, making it incredibly easy to seize the final, most valuable asset in my name. They calculated my grief as a prime opportunity for a hostile acquisition. But they fundamentally misjudged my capacity for retaliation. I wasn't weeping over my lost marriage, I was brutally auditing it, and the resulting math was completely unforgiving. I recognized that my habit of compromising had effectively invited them to dismantle my autonomy. By never pushing back against Brenda's passive-aggressive insults or Jason's financial recklessness, I had signed a blank check, handing them absolute permission to cross every line. The trap of cruel normalization relies entirely on the victim's willingness to avoid conflict at all costs. But the cost of avoiding this conflict was the systematic erasure of my identity and my inheritance. I rubbed my eyes trying to summon a shred of grief for the man I thought I had married, but there was only profound clarity. The emotional theater was permanently closed. I was now operating strictly on reason, and reason dictated that every single liability in this room needed to be immediately liquidated. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the tense silence in the kitchen. A sleek town car pulled up to the cabin, and out stepped my great-aunt Margaret. At 88 years old, Margaret was a formidable corporate litigator who had shattered glass ceilings decades before Jason was even born. She walked with a silver-tipped cane, her posture perfectly straight, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying competence. She didn't knock. She opened the door and stepped into the entryway, completely ignoring Jason and Brenda. Margaret had been the silent architect of my mother's estate, and she brought with her a profound, heavy realization. This is the hidden regret of the silent guardian. For years, Margaret had watched from afar as I allowed my husband and mother-in-law to walk all over me. She had witnessed my boundaries being trampled and my resources being drained. But she also knew that true autonomy cannot be gifted. It must be fiercely claimed. If she had intervened earlier, fighting my battles for me, I would have remained completely dependent and permanently fragile. She had to endure the agonizing process of letting me hit absolute rock bottom, waiting in the shadows for the exact moment my conditioned compliance shattered and my spine finally solidified. She had to let the fire burn just enough to forge my resolve, regretting the pain I had to endure, but knowing it was the only way I would learn to become my own absolute authority. Margaret walked up to the granite island and dropped a thick, leather-bound legal dossier next to my deed of trust. Jason tried to puff out his chest, stepping forward to assert his fabricated dominance, but Margaret silenced him with a single glacial stare. She didn't address him, She looked directly at me. The documentation she brought wasn't just a simple halt to the property sale, it was a comprehensive federal level injunction. Margaret had officially shifted the battlefield from a messy, emotional domestic dispute into a high stakes, ruthless professional arena. She laid out the immediate legal parameters. The real estate transaction Brenda had attempted to orchestrate was formally frozen by a court order. Any further attempt to access the property, stage the cabin, or list the estate would be treated as criminal trespassing and fraud. Jason's face turned the color of wet ash. He was an accountant who loved to play with numbers, but he was entirely out of his depth against a woman who wrote the legal codes he pretended to understand. Margaret handed me the reins of the operation. She didn't coddle me or offer a warm, comforting hug. She offered me the exact legal instruments required to execute a flawless corporate dismantling. The power dynamic in the room inverted with the crushing weight of a collapsing skyscraper. Jason and Brenda were no longer dealing with a grieving, compliant teacher. They were facing an ironclad legal coalition, and they had absolutely no structural defense. I felt a cold, deep satisfaction settling in my chest. For years, I had been the designated shock absorber for their endless crises, quietly managing the fallout of their reckless decisions. Now, the liability was entirely theirs. Margaret stood silently by my side, an unbreakable pillar of institutional power, watching as the reality of their massive miscalculation washed over them. The aggressive eviction they had planned for me had just become their own unmitigated legal trap. The true depth of their betrayal was fully exposed during the comprehensive legal audit that Margaret and I conducted over the next 48 hours. We sat in the quiet sanctuary of my mother's art studio, systematically pulling apart every financial record and municipal filing tied to the estate. We weren't looking for apologies, we were looking for leverage. What we found was a catastrophic state-level felony. Brenda, in her arrogant rush to liquidate the property, had not just listed the cabin illegally, she had taken out a massive secondary mortgage against the estate 6 months prior. To secure that capital, she needed clear collateral. My mother's historic art studio, a detached building on the property that held immense sentimental and historical value, was deemed a structural liability by Brenda's aggressive developers. So Brenda had filed municipal demolition permits to have it leveled and paved over to increase the lot's commercial appeal, but there was a glaring, fatal flaw in her paperwork. The property had always been strictly in my name and my mother's name. In order to secure the secondary mortgage and authorize the demolition permits, Brenda had explicitly forged my signature on over a dozen federal banking documents and city planning forms. Jason, utilizing his position as a commissioned notary public, had knowingly affixed his official seal to these forgeries, falsely certifying that I had appeared before him to sign them. His arrogance led him to believe that his professional authority would serve as an impenetrable shield for our fraud. I stared at the photocopies of the permits on the wooden desk. The loops of the ink were a clumsy, arrogant imitation of my handwriting. This was the ultimate, inescapable kill shot. Brenda had committed severe felony forgery and federal bank fraud in a desperate, calculated attempt to completely erase my mother's legacy and steal my inheritance. Jason, as a certified public accountant, had notarized the documents, making him an active co-conspirator in a massive financial crime. This drastically reframed the entire conflict. This was never about a simple family misunderstanding or a greedy real estate flip. It was a calculated, ruthless medical and corporate theft. They had essentially planted a massive financial bomb directly into the foundation of my life. If detonated, it would have left me completely bankrupt, homeless, and legally responsible for hundreds of thousands of dollars in unauthorized debt. I downloaded every falsified invoice, every altered permit, and the exact time-stamped banking log showing Brenda receiving the funds. I secured the data on 3 separate, heavily encrypted drives. I didn't feel a shred of despair. I felt the sharp, undeniable satisfaction of an auditor who had just found the exact discrepancy required to send a corrupt executive to federal prison. They thought they were brilliantly building an untraceable, highly lucrative exit strategy. They didn't realize they had just handed me the precise legal ammunition required to absolutely annihilate their entire existence. The betrayal had officially crossed the line from a painful divorce into a highly documented federal crime. My retaliation was strictly about protecting my personal liberty and executing an uncompromising surgical strike. I closed the laptop, the screen reflecting a woman completely devoid of mercy. The sheer audacity of their plan was matched only by their incredible stupidity. They had assumed my grief would make me a blind, passive witness to my own financial execution. Instead, their forged signatures were now the ironclad foundation of their impending criminal indictments. I compiled the evidence into a single, devastating dossier. There would be no negotiations. There would be no out-of-court settlements to save the family face. I was going to deliver the final invoice, and the cost was going to be their absolute ruin. I did not invite them to a neutral location or arrange a meeting with our attorneys. I summoned Jason and Brenda back to the very porch where they had arrogantly attempted to evict me just 3 days prior. They arrived in Jason's least luxury sedan, wearing expressions of irritated entitlement. They still believed they were dealing with a minor legal hiccup, an annoying delay in their inevitable payday. They walked up the wooden steps, ready to issue new threats and demand my immediate compliance. I stood on the porch, holding the heavy bound dossier. I did not greet them. I simply handed Jason the file. I did not offer a greeting. Instead, I let the heavy binder fall onto the wooden porch with a thud that seemed to echo their impending defeat, then slid the dossier toward him with the detached precision of a surgeon. "This is not a negotiation," I stated, my voice cutting through the freezing Vermont air with clinical precision. "This is a formal notification of your impending criminal indictments." Jason tore open the folder, his eyes scanning the first page. It was a fully drafted, certified criminal complaint addressed directly to the district attorney's office, detailing the federal bank fraud, the forged demolition permits, and the illegal secondary mortgage. Attached were the flawless forensic handwriting analyses and the notarized logs proving his active complicity as a certified public accountant. The power flip was instantaneous, absolute, and beautiful to witness. The color completely drained from Jason's face. His hands began to visibly shake. He was an arrogant man who loved to play high-stakes financial games, but the sudden, terrifying reality of a multi-year federal prison sentence completely shattered his facade. He looked at his mother, his eyes wide with stark, primal panic. Brenda tried to snatch the folder from him, demanding to know what lies I had fabricated, but as she saw her own forged signatures staring back at her, her voice died in her throat. The illusion of their power evaporated entirely. This is the ultimate vulnerability of a manipulator. They are completely disarmed when confronted with irrefutable hard data. They had expected me to scream, to cry, to beg for my home. Instead, I had executed a flawless, emotionless audit that left them with absolutely no structural defense. Jason opened his mouth, stammering out a desperate, pathetic plea. He tried to claim it was a terrible mistake, a desperate measure to secure our financial future. He begged me not to destroy his accounting career. "You don't have a career, Jason," I replied, my tone completely flat and devoid of any human warmth. "Your professional licenses will be revoked by the end of the week, and your assets are officially frozen. You are legally locked out of the life you tried to steal." I stepped back inside the cabin. I didn't offer a parting insult. I didn't wait for their apologies, because an apology from a cornered thief is nothing but a manipulation tactic. I looked them dead in the eye, firmly pulled the heavy oak door shut, and engaged the deadbolt. The lock clicked with a heavy, satisfying finality, permanently sealing them out of my property and my life. I stood in the quiet warmth of the entryway, listening to the muffled sounds of their frantic arguing on the porch outside. The aggressive eviction they had meticulously planned had completely inverted, leaving them standing in the freezing cold, facing the absolute destruction of their own making. I walked away from the door and into my mother's studio, the space I had successfully defended. The war was over, and the ledger was finally balanced. The criminal justice system moved with ruthless efficiency. Armed with the ironclad dossier of forged permits and fraudulent banking logs, the district attorneys secured maximum sentences for both Jason and Brenda. There were no plea deals to salvage their reputations. Without the parasitic weight of my husband constantly draining my resources, my savings grew exponentially. I formally moved into the cabin, fully reclaiming my mother's art studio. I filled the space with light, new canvases, and the profound, unshakable quiet of absolute sovereignty. The air inside my home was finally free of tension. Looking back at the brutal corporate war I had to wage against my own family, my thoughts have become deeply reflective. I've come to realize that forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free from the ghost of their influence. But forgiveness absolutely does not require reconciliation. You can forgive someone while permanently revoking their access to your life. I learned the hard way that loyalty to your own soul must always supersede loyalty to blood or a marriage certificate. Society constantly pressures us to be the ultimate peacemakers, conditioning us to endure endless disrespect simply to keep the family unit intact. We are told to compromise, to look the other way, and to maintain a performative peace at the expense of our own sanity. Reject that narrative entirely. Performative peace is just a polite term for silent suffering. When the people closest to you are secretly laying explosives in the foundation of your life, the only rational response is to walk away and detonate their plans from a completely safe, legally enforced distance. True peace is not always warm and fuzzy. It does not always look like a crowded dining table filled with laughter. Sometimes true peace is solitary. It is cold, uncompromising, and fiercely protected. When you finally stop paying the emotional toll for people who refuse to respect your boundaries, you realize something incredibly liberating. The profound quiet you are left with isn't loneliness, it is exactly the freedom you paid for. I built my new life from scratch, utilizing a foundation that no one else holds the deed to. I am no longer an unpaid employee in someone else's fabricated reality. I am the sole architect of my future. To anyone currently exhausting their own emotional bandwidth to maintain the illusion of a perfect partnership for someone who constantly diminishes your worth, you must stop. Stop being the silent underwriter for your own destruction. Your loyalty and your capital are incredibly valuable assets. Do not invest them in people who view your devotion as an exploitable weakness. Reclaim your intellectual property, absorb the temporary pain of the demolition, and violently rebuild your own empire from the ashes. If this story moved you, or if you've ever had to cut a toxic person out of your life to save your own peace, hit that share button. You never know who might need this reminder today. Thanks for being here.